Assassin's Creed Rogue is a niche game. Even more than Revelations, it's a game that banks its entire success on appealing to people who are already major Assassin's Creed fans. It's a midquel branching the stories of Assassin's Creed 4 and Assassin's Creed 3 that also makes its whole selling point that this time you're a Templar instead of an assassin. A selling point that only makes sense if you already know what those things are. It was also victim to one of the strangest and worst experiments in release scheduling I've ever seen. Rogue was released on the same day as Assassin's Creed Unity, the next big installment in the series, which was set up to mix up the format, bring the series to the new generation, etc, etc. But since this was during a transition period, Rogue was released on the same day, exclusive to the previous generation. It didn't get a launch on the Xbox One and PS4 until the remaster 4 years later. Shockingly, this same-day release plan absolutely buried any buzz around Rogue. You may remember that Unity's launch was a little dramatic, so while that was exploding, Rogue flew completely under the radar and has remained one of the more obscure titles in the series to this day, despite technically being considered a mainline title, not a spin-off. Rogue is overlooked, but is it actually underrated? Because that's an important distinction. This is going to be interesting. See, when I first played Rogue back in 2014, I loved it. I was a late adopter to the Xbox One, so I took Rogue as my consolation prize and happily watched the shitstorm around Unity unfold while I happily played what seemed to me a much better game. In replaying Rogue, I've come to some different conclusions. I'm not convinced Rogue is actually as good as I thought it was. I still like it, but it's a villain origin story that fundamentally understands what makes a villain origin story interesting, set in the Assassin's Creed game that cares the least out of any of them about its historical period. I started listening to a 30-hour book about the 7 Years' War for this video, only to realise that this game has absolutely nothing to say about the 7 Years' War, so that was a waste of time. What I found instead in Rogue was a whole bunch of wasted potential, possibly the most wasted potential of any game in the series because it has such a strong hook. And a genuinely interesting protagonist who could have made a great hook if the game had anything meaningful to say, but for some reason it decides awkwardly that it doesn't want to. Rogue has a reputation as being the darkest game in the series, but I don't really understand why, because it's honestly not that dark, or even all that rogue. My thoughts are complicated and maybe we should just get into this, so without further ado, let's talk about Assassin's Creed Rogue.
Stay my blade from the flesh of the innocent. Hide in plain sight. Never compromise the Assassin Brotherhood. These are the tenets of the Creed, the principles I used to live by. I was a young man then. The 7 Years' War was about to begin. I could not have imagined what the future had in store for me, nor the cost I would choose to bear. My name is Shay Patrick Cormac. This is my story.
Doing my job for me there, Shay, but what he said, Assassin's Creed Rogue is the story of Shay Cormac's fall from grace, how he went from an assassin to a hunter of assassins for the Templars. On a wider scale, it also serves to bridge the gap between Black Flag and Assassin's Creed 3. At the end of Black Flag, the Assassins had made significant gains in the Americas, but by Assassin's Creed 3, they're all but defeated except for a bitter old man on a hill. Rogue is the story of how exactly that happened. A villain story is a pretty hard narrative to pull off in a satisfying way. There is a reason that games where you play as a full-on bad guy are rare. It's because being a full-on bad guy isn't really that fun for most people. Doing bad things makes people feel bad. Games where you just play as a psychotic murderer exist, but they are very niche. Satisfying murder requires satisfying motivation. Rogue spends its first two sequences with Shay during his time with the Assassins doing completely typical Assassin's Creed things, but there is a difference in framing that makes all the difference. The sort of people you're ordered to kill, and why. The Assassins in every game are professional murderers, that's what the word means, but the previous games have always set this up in a way that your targets clearly deserve to be murdered. They're assholes, and they usually fight back. Your first targets in Rogue are a terminally ill man and two old cowards who run away from you. The reason you're murdering these men has less to do with their actions and more to do with the artifacts they have in their possession. A box and a manuscript that together can point the way to precursor sites. Murdering an already dying old man for a book is, on a surface level, not a very noble thing to do, and it's ultimately his failure to engage with anything beyond the surface level that leads to Shay's corruption. This is a tricky thing to pull off, and I don't think it entirely works just because one of the biggest problems with Rogue is that it's way too short, less than half the length of Black Flag and shorter than even Revelations. Shay's fall to the dark side is slow, but the game is short, and these two things mesh weirdly, leading to bizarre instances where multiple years will pass in the span of a single chapter of the story. Shay's character flaw is his simplicity. He doesn't analyse things too closely and only reacts to things that are right in front of him. The problem is that with this short runtime, the audience doesn't get to see the bigger picture either. We're only shown the surface level things as well. Achilles' Brotherhood are all kinda jerks, with the exception of Shay's childhood friend Liam. They all pick on Shay and admonish him for being naive and not listening to them. Which he is and he doesn't, but Shay doesn't reflect on this and instead views them in a high school bully sort of way. Particularly the Frenchman Louis-Joseph Gauthier Chevalier de la Vendée. Now that's a French noble name, Arno. Chevalier is a prick, especially to Shay, who he nicknames Cabbage Farmer. More than anyone else, it's Chevalier that makes Shay question why he's even with the assassins to begin with. And frankly, if that's all it takes, then that's a pretty good question. Shay does not have the drive that the other protagonists have had for joining the assassins. He wasn't trained from birth like Altair. He isn't on a quest for revenge like Ezio, for freedom like Connor or Adewale, or for redemption like Edward. Shay was just recruited because he had potential. In any other game, Shay would be one of those assassin recruits you pick up off the street. This lack of a clear motivation leads to a surface-level understanding of the assassins. These people are assholes sending me to murder old men for books. Without clear motives, Shay's loyalty to the assassins is tenuous at best, and the assassins are not really forthcoming with more information because the rest of them are able to see the bigger picture which Shay isn't. If your principles are entirely dependent on people being nice to you, then they're not very strong principles. Just because someone is a dick doesn't mean that they're wrong. Likewise, just because someone appears frail and weak doesn't mean that they actually are, or that they deserve to live. All three men that you kill are slave owners who use their positions of power to oppress and control people for their own purposes, which you may remember as Templars is total global subjugation. They're bad men, but on a surface level it feels kinda icky to kill them, so who can really say what's good or bad? None of this is to say that Shay is a bad person, or even an unlikable protagonist. In fact, it's his kind of basic earnestness that makes him a good protagonist. He wants to do good, but he has a completely surface-level understanding of what doing good actually means. Doing good is when you're nice, and doing bad is when you're mean. All of this is a great setup for a fall from grace. The issues start to come in the way it's executed. One issue is of course the length of the game. It's too short to give a lot of these ideas the time they deserve. But the other is that the game decides that it doesn't want to have good guys and bad guys. It wants to make this situation morally ambiguous. It wants you as the player to be able to see both sides and ultimately maybe even agree with Shay's decision to join the Templars. It does this by making the final straw so completely over the top that it justifies murdering every last assassin. The box sends Shay to Lipson in 1755, the time and place of a devastating earthquake that pretty much levelled the entire city and killed over 60,000 people. It's one of the most significant events of the era and often cited as one of the primary causes of the Age of Enlightenment, a natural disaster of such immense magnitude during a day of God, All Saints' Day, that people started to question the benevolence or even the existence of God at all, and Rogue makes it Shay's fault.
How could God do this to them?
God had nothing to do with this.
Shay finds a precursor temple underneath the convent at the centre of the city, a bit of a nostalgic throwback to the tombs of Assassin's Creed 2, but instead of an Apple of Eden or some other artifact, the thing dissolves in his hands and triggers the earthquake. The execution of the scene is a bit awkward because I don't think a massive earthquake really makes for the best atmosphere for parkour, and he's running towards the ocean as if that would be safe, even though historically the earthquake was accompanied by a massive tsunami wave. But narratively the point is clear. This tragedy was Shay's fault. Accidentally or not, he was messing with things that are better left unmessed with. But Shay doesn't blame himself, he blames the people who sent him there, initially accusing Achilles of somehow knowing what would happen and sending Shay there to do on purpose. This is where the game loses me a bit because the way this happens just feels so rushed. It's the sort of thing that could be resolved if everyone just calmed down for half a second and had a grown-up conversation. Shay is young and has just been through a traumatic event, even though the journey back to New York would have taken at least a few weeks and I would have thought he would have cooled off by then, but he's not thinking clearly, obviously.
So what's the next city you want me to smite? What happened in Haiti happened in Portugal. A great earthquake. Thousands dead thanks to your damned manuscript!
This cannot be.
Shay, a person cannot start an earthquake!
A person meddling with these precursor machines could. You saw the box, Hope. The temple was filled to bursting with that kind of power. You made me slaughter innocents!
How dare you!
The issue with the scene is that all of the assassins have to behave in an extremely sinister manner for any of this to actually unfold the way it does. For reasons beyond my understanding, Achilles never denies Shay's accusations directly, instead skirting around it in a way that can only suggest that he did know even though he obviously didn't. Then he forces Shay to sit out in the cold instead of letting him vent and then actually sitting down with him to figure out what happened. The assassins need to behave this way so that it feels justified when Shay betrays them. It's part of the game's attempt to make this situation morally grey, to paint the assassins as, if not complicit, then dangerously misguided. I don't have a problem with the assassins being in the wrong, they're only human, but they're behaving irrationally hostile towards Shay for no given reason. Of course, that may be the point. Like with everything else, we're locked in Shay's perspective. We don't get to see what the other assassins talk about once Shay leaves the room. We're left with only Shay's assumptions and perceptions. Ironically, a lot of Rogue starts to come across in the same way as Liberation did, as Templar propaganda, only this time we don't get to see the unedited truth. That's probably more than a coincidence, considering that Rogue was made by the same studio that made Liberation, Ubisoft Sofia, and Rogue shares quite a bit of its DNA with Liberation. While Unity was in development for quite a few years, Rogue was made in just a year, which explains why it's quite so short, and it is to Black Flag what Liberation was to Assassin's Creed 3. Rogue is mechanically identical to Black Flag, down to even using the exact same UI, only this time things are coloured blue when you complete them instead of gold. The progression systems are identical, the nautical combat is pretty much identical with a few minor enhancements, the open world rhythms are identical, and most of the combat animations are identical, and you know what? I'm fine with that. Black Flag was a great game, and more Black Flag is nothing to complain about. Some people get really pissy about this kind of reuse, but the reality is that Rogue wouldn't exist at all if they couldn't reuse all of this stuff. Rogue takes the same mechanics and rhythms of Black Flag and places them in the setting of Assassin's Creed 3, which creates a mechanical bridge to go alongside the narrative one. And Rogue also serves as a last hurrah to this entire era of Assassin's Creed. Unity was the forward-thinking title that mixed up the formula, so Rogue does the opposite. It looks backwards and celebrates everything that made the old formula work so well. The open world is what saves Rogue from being just a spin-off title, because while the story is much shorter than Black Flag, the open world is equally expansive and possibly even bigger than Black Flag. It's split into 3 parts: the North Atlantic around the coast of Nova Scotia, the River Valley, which is a smooshed together chunk of Virginia interconnecting a bunch of rivers and settlements, and finally the entire city of New York, back from Assassin's Creed 3, but bigger because it was half burned down by a fire during the time of Assassin's Creed 3. Each region offers a different experience, which keeps the game feeling fresh. The North Atlantic is mechanically the most similar to Black Flag, large open seas filled with ships to loot and very smaller places to stop and explore. But visually it feels totally different to Black Flag, with all the snow and ice. It's where Rogue is at its most distinct from any other game in the series, with Shay's black and red Templar coat contrasted against the white and blue snow and ice. And with the northern lights during the night, it's just a very pretty visual. The River Valley is an interesting experiment in merging the open worlds of Black Flag and Assassin's Creed 3. There are some ships to loot, but your ship is mostly used for navigation between some much larger on-foot locations to explore. Interestingly, it feels like an ancestor to what Odyssey would eventually make the basis of its entire open world of Greece. And New York is New York. It wasn't overly interesting in Assassin's Creed 3, and it's not overly interesting in this game either, although they do try their best by injecting some colour into it. It offers the most traditional Assassin's Creed stuff of jumping around on rooftops. Because the story is so short, more than any other game in the series really, Rogue is driven by open-world Skinner box activities. And there is an awful lot of stuff to do in Rogue. It brings back the naval forts of 4, as well as the non-naval forts of Brotherhood, now reskinned as gang hideouts for gangs supported by the assassins. It brings back Brotherhood's renovations, incorporating the Black Flag ship upgrade resources into the system as well. It has not one, not two, but 3 separate treasure hunts to partake in for special outfits that you'll never ever wear because they look really silly. And along with that, almost every other collectible has some kind of narrative tied to it, even the previously worthless Animus fragments, which now unlock a cryptic message from Juno hiding in the cloud. The game brings back Freedom Cry's slave ships, although in this game they're reskinned as POW ships, something which I had completely forgotten was even in this game. To facilitate the transition to Templar mechanically, the game even brings in some mechanics from Assassin's Creed multiplayer. There's a new type of enemy that sits in hiding, waiting for an opportunity to assassinate you, which you can root out using the detection meter and audio cues from the multiplayer mode. The result of all of this is that Rogue genuinely does play like a big celebration of all of the Assassin's Creeds that have come before. There's even a variety of bombs akin to Revelations, although this does lead to one of the most unintentionally hilarious moments in the series, when Benjamin Franklin gifts you with an underbarrel mounted grenade launcher, a real jumping the crossbow moment. The real problem with Rogue's open world is the lack of balance between narrative and Skinner box content. You're likely to run out of story long before you run out of stuff to do in the open world, and motivation to do that sort of thing can go out of the window when it feels like you've already finished the game. The result is that Rogue is a great podcast game. A lot of the Assassin's Creeds are, but Rogue especially because you can easily spend 15 to 20 hours in the game without hearing a single line of dialogue, which is about twice as long as the amount of time you'll spend in the actual story. As much time as I tend to spend on narrative in these critiques, it's kind of important to note for this one especially that the vast majority of my time in Rogue is spent just doing stuff in the open world. Even playing as the baddies, Rogue is as cozy as ever, and that's ultimately a much bigger problem for me than the shortness of the story. After betraying the assassins and falling off a cliff and being shot, don't worry, nobody ever dies of fall damage, Shay is picked up and rescued by General Monroe, the kindest Templar you ever did meet. This is how Shay's journey to the Templars begins, with the abundant generosity of Monroe, to whom Shay immediately feels he owes a debt of gratitude to. Monroe doesn't initially reveal his allegiances, instead he works with Shay to help take down some of those assassin-funded gangs I mentioned, whilst playing ignorant to the gang's true allegiances, and eventually enlists Shay's help fighting against the French. These sequences with Monroe make up the middle chunk of the game, sequences 3 and 4, and are really the critical moments of Shay's path to the dark side. Except, of course, that the game can't quite decide if it is actually the dark side or not. Monroe is, with no qualms or caveats, a good, honourable man. He wants the best for his people and his soldiers, and he works to give them as such. He's the one who introduces Shay to the renovations because he believes in the power of urban renewal. Monroe is here to make both me and Shay question if the Templars are really the bad guys. A question that in the context of all of the previous games is an absolutely insane thing to ask. If Monroe, an obviously good and nice guy, sides with the Templars, then maybe they're not so bad after all. Except to actually believe that, you have to discard that the Templars' overall master plan is global enslavement and always has been. Throughout all of the games, the Templars have been completely amoral, ruthless sociopaths whose only motivation is personal power, driven by the delusion that they are superior to everyone else. The reason this story had to be set in this time period has nothing to do with the 7 Years' War and everything to do with the fact that Hatham's Templars are the only group in the series that you could even try to make sympathetic. And that's only because Hatham was deliberately framed that way as a red herring. And I want to believe that Rogue understands that it knows that being a Templar is antithetical to being a good man because it requires subscribing to an inherently self-serving and egotistical philosophy. That you know what's best for people better than they know themselves. It requires believing that you are physically and intellectually superior to your fellow man. There's 2 levels at which you can engage with Rogue. The surface level, taking everything you're shown at face value, or the deeper level, reading between the lines to get a better understanding of what's going on. And my confusion at what the game is trying to say comes from how much it expects me to actually engage with the game on that deeper level. Let's take, for example, these assassin-backed gangs. On the surface level, gangs are bad, they hurt innocent people and are generally a public menace. Things are safer and cleaner without street gangs around. On a deeper level, nothing is true and everything is permitted. Breaking the law is a crime only by the societal standards of the system it's within. But who's to say that those rules are just? Who's to say that the red codes aren't worse than the gangs you're taking down? I am. They're much worse. Historically, there was a big gang issue in New York in this era, but a lot of those gangs were made up of runaway slaves, because New York was one of the biggest importers of slaves in North America. The British Empire was not a force for good in the world. Just because they represented the rule of law does not mean that they were the good guys. Shay's willingness to nod along and accept that the rules are good is emblematic of his fundamental lack of curiosity about his own actions. Monroe told him it's the right thing to do, and Monroe is a good man, therefore he must be doing good. The problem is that I don't know how intentional this reading of the game is. I want to believe it's correct because it makes more sense and is much more interesting, but to do so I'm ignoring some contradictions. One is that the gangs are stockpiling deadly gas, which one can only assume is intended to be used in some sort of gas attack. Ben Franklin made that grenade launcher for Hope, the assassin leader of the gangs. Gas is famously hard to control, and any sort of attack would absolutely result in the deaths of innocent people, which breaks rule number 1 of the Assassin's Creed. Although I guess it's technically not a blade, so loophole. Secondly, in at least one of these hideouts in my playthrough, I was given the objective to kill the slaver, which kind of fundamentally breaks the idea that these gangs have any sort of moral high ground at all, and turns the entire Assassin Brotherhood into a bunch of hypocrites. This is an optional location which is never addressed in the story, so it's entirely possible that it's just an oversight, but if it's not, then what is the game trying to say exactly? Are we really both siding the Assassin-Templar conflict? On the subject of hypocrisy, the Assassins backed the French in the 7 Years' War, which Shay calls out as hypocritical considering that Adewale has spent the last 20 years fighting against the French Empire exactly because of their participation in slavery. Surface level, hypocrisy is bad and slavery is bad. Why would you help the bad guys? Deeper level, the assassins transcend political boundaries and do not care about appearing hypocritical because on a large scale that doesn't matter at all. Within the context of the 7 Years' War, backing the French gives the assassins a better shot at their ultimate objective, which is freedom for everyone. Specifically, the French are much better allies to the Native American populations than the British, and having the two powers at each other's throats gives the natives a much more advantageous position. There is a reason it's also called the French and Indian War. The assassins do not support the French, they're assisting the French up until the point that allegiance stops being useful. And we know from playing Assassin's Creed 3 that they have a point, that the lack of any French presence in America is ultimately one of the things that spells dooms for the natives, because without the French as an obstacle, they become the new obstacle. And again, I have to question how intentional this deeper reading is, because the game specifically includes a mission where you save an Oneida village from an assassin gang and enlist their assistance. The clan mother even spins a tale about how Shay is the hero they've been waiting for, and if he finds all the totem thingies, he can get the special armour in their cave. Exactly how much cynicism am I supposed to have about the way this is all framed? The natives were not a monolith, and different tribes did back different sides during the war, and representing that isn't necessarily an issue. But also, what's all this white saviour shit about, eh? Why on earth is a white Irishman the hero of prophecy? You look like a clown, Shay. Am I supposed to understand this as problematic? The only thing I can figure is that these contradictions are placed on purpose to try and make the whole situation feel more morally ambiguous than it actually is. And that's exactly why I say the game feels like Templar propaganda. It feels like a deliberate attempt to villainize the assassins and exonerate the Templars. The game never addresses the core issues with Templar philosophy, primarily because Shay never asks about it, and they're not going to offer him any information that might make him wary of them. Shay engages with the Templars on a surface level, that's what makes him a useful tool, but the game is constantly giving me hints that while he's a tool, he's still morally justified in his actions, and that seems insane. I haven't even mentioned the modern day story yet, but that's another important piece of this puzzle. Rogue reuses everything from Black Flag. It's another adventure in Abstergo entertainment, only this time you're more explicitly working for the Templars. You're technically playing a different data analyst from the last time, and you're accessing Shay's memory to release some sort of virus onto the servers that's causing all sorts of issues in the building. Because you started it, the two security experts brought in from Abstergo Corporate enlist your help to fix it, and these two are very obviously Templars. In fact, almost the entirety of the modern day sections in Rogue are dedicated to building up and exploring the character of your boss, Juhani Otso Berg. Berg has actually technically been in the games before because he was the player character for Assassin's Creed Revelations multiplayer. He was the Templar going through the Animus training program, but for the sake of simplicity I'm just going to ignore that and pretend this is the first time we're meeting him. Berg is the Templars' fixer, a special forces guy who does all their dirty work and hunts down assassins. Part of Rogue is clearly trying to establish Berg as a villain for future games to run with, and honestly he's a pretty good villain. He has a sort of calm and collected sociopath demeanour that makes him quite effective. He's also a bit of a Shay Cormac fanboy. He even dresses in a similar way to Shay despite it being 300 years later. But the weird element of all of this is that Berg believes that Shay's story says something, that it exposes the fundamental superiority of Templar ideology over the Assassins, and that because of this, Shay's story is dangerous to the Assassins. And clearly the game agrees with this assessment. Why else would the Assassins place a virus on Shay's memories? Berg's final plan is to upload Shay's story to the Assassin Network as some sort of statement, and when you do that, it causes mass panic and hysteria. Clearly, they think Shay's story is a stunning indictment of the Assassins. But why? On the surface level, it's because Shay was an assassin who betrayed them and killed them all, showcasing that the Templars are superior and the Assassins are weak and dumb and wrong. But on a deeper level, if I'm supposed to read into things and understand that Shay is a victim of circumstance manipulated and controlled by the Templars, then his story is a tragedy and a cautionary tale, but hardly a damning condemnation of assassin philosophy. If that's the case, then I don't understand why his story freaks out the Assassins quite so much. Rogue and Unity both have this weird, misguided idea that the Assassin-Templar conflict is more interesting if the Templars and Assassins are actually just as bad as each other, and that's just such a misguided belief. The reason the Templars are at their most interesting in Assassin's Creed 3 isn't because Haytham has a good point, it's that he's very good at making a bad one. That's what makes him so dangerous and compelling. The Templars are not technically white supremacists, but it's not coincidence that all of the Templars in Assassin's Creed 3 and most of the games are old white men, because both philosophies are rooted in the belief of their own supremacy. They use this belief to justify murder, manipulation, war, and all other atrocities in the name of forcefully imposing their idea of a perfect world on everyone. That's why they're the bad guys. But being the bad guys doesn't make their motives any less human. Bad people exist in real life too, and we gain nothing from pretending that people like this have a valid point. I don't know, maybe it's just that working on this video in November 2024, I don't have much patience left for centrist hedging. But I find this dilution of the conflict that drives the narrative of the entire franchise to be counterproductive, let's put it that way. In the case of Rogue in particular, it robs Shay's story of a lot of the weight it could have as a character study of how a good-natured person can be convinced to commit atrocities. Instead, it's just because the Assassins are dicks for no good reason. Shay has the potential to be the most interesting protagonist in the series, and maybe he still is if you're able to ignore all the contradictions that justify his actions. The story of how a fundamentally good person can end up on the wrong side of history is a common and important story to explore because the answers are so fundamentally human. Like all of us, Shay is not a flawlessly logical and rational person. He acts, first and foremost, with his emotions and with the information that is presented in front of him. He's a kid who grew up on the street who deep down, like most of us, is just looking for a place to belong. That's not a strong enough motive for a group like the Assassins. Commitment to that sort of fight requires more than a sense of belonging. It requires a fire burning in your soul that Shay doesn't possess, which is why the other Assassins dismiss him. The Templars don't even need to do much to sway him to their side because of that. He's a man openly looking for guidance, and they only need to present it with a friendly face for him to be sure that he's on the right side. He doesn't want to be told that he's wrong. He wants a friendly pat on the shoulder and the insistence that he doesn't need to change anything. One of the hardest parts of the game, at least emotionally, is the point where the game forces you to kill Adewale. He's an old man in his 60s by this point, but still the fierce warrior for freedom that he always was. But he's also in your way, and moreover a legend and an inspiration amongst the Assassins. The Templars need him gone. There's really no amount of rationalization that can be done to justify killing Adewale, a man who's spent his entire life fighting for freedom from oppression and saving thousands of people from a life of slavery. A man who sails a ship with a broken shackle as its symbol. A man who, when you gain the upper hand, beaches that ship just to save the lives of his crew. So how exactly does Shay justify killing Adewale, or rather, how do the Templars justify it for him?
Kenway seems determined to destroy Adewale.
Aren't you? He's a powerful man in his own right, and a symbol of hope for the Assassins. Eliminating him would shake them to the core.
It would, I know. But it seems a shame. He's a good man, Gist.
So was Elder Washington and Smith. I rather enjoyed training with him. Wardrop too, though the man could not hold his liquor. He and Weeks never got along, you know.
If you're trying to test my conscience, Gist, you've succeeded.
This conversation, more than any other in the game, really demonstrates what a snake your Templar buddy and first mate Christopher Guest actually is, because he just equated Adewale to 3 slave owners. And his little comment about how Weeks never got along with Wardrop, yeah, I'm not surprised given that Weeks is the only Black Templar on the team. If Shay actually sat down and thought about this conversation for a few minutes, then he might realise what Gist is doing. He's playing on Shay's guilt at killing these old, seemingly defenceless men by humanising them with this drinking story. And he's doing that so that Shay feels less bad about killing one more good man, because at least this time he's doing it for the right reasons. The majority of Shay's discussions with Gist are like this. Gist hides his true motives under this bravado and showy persona to always keep nudging Shay towards the decisions that they want him to make. But fundamentally, Shay just doesn't want to think too hard about it. He only wants to be reassured that he's doing the right thing, and as a man who accidentally killed 60,000 people, that's a very human response to his situation. Killing Adewale is a real point of no return for Shay, the point where there can be no more forgiveness from the remaining assassins and really no redemption for himself. He's in too deep, but he convinces himself that he needs to do it, that the assassins are simply too dangerous to be left alive, that it's for the greater good. And when he doubts himself, surrogate father figure Hatham is there to give him a supportive pat on the shoulder. Once you cross that line, it's very hard to pull back. There's a great deliberate parallel between a scene in Rogue and a scene in Assassin's Creed 3. In both scenes, the main character is interrogating a prisoner alongside Hatham, and in both scenes, Hatham kills the prisoner once they get the information, even after suggesting that they'll be allowed to live. In Assassin's Creed 3, this is a moment of realization for Connor that breaks any sort of faith he had that his father was actually a good man. Killing defenseless prisoners pleading for their lives is just not a very good vibe, so Connor freaks the hell out about it. But for Shay, the blood splatters all over his face and he just wipes it off and keeps walking. That's the gradual shift that comes from this kind of indoctrination. The Shay from the beginning of the game would have flipped out in the same way as Connor, but now that he's been here for years, constantly praised by the Templars for loyalty and assurances that he's on the right side, he can shake off this sort of thing surprisingly easily, rationalise it away as a necessary evil and just keep walking the path. He killed Adewale. Does the life of one random gang member really matter? As you hunt down the remaining assassins, the way that Shay constantly apologises to them while actively trying to kill them is just so telling. He's successfully excused himself of his own actions, convinced himself that murdering his friends is the right thing to do, and justifies any guilt he might feel about it personally. He's been successfully indoctrinated, to the point where when Achilles finds another temple and immediately recognises that Shay was right all along, Shay isn't even having the same argument he was having in the first place. Gradually, the reasons he's been chasing after Achilles and the assassins have changed. Initially, it's because he thought Achilles sent him to kill those people on purpose. Then, when it became obvious that wasn't true, it was because the assassins were fools, meddling with things they don't understand. Now, with Achilles standing in front of the thing, clearly understanding what he's looking at, Shay's argument is just that it's Achilles' fault for not listening to him in the first place. An argument that his actions are justified because if they weren't justified, then he just spent the last decade murdering his friends for no reason. And that simply can't be true, so he displaces the blame for his own actions onto Achilles instead. Shay's tragedy is really wrapped up in his catchphrase.
I make my own luck. I make my own luck. I make my own luck. I make my own luck.
How many times do I have to tell you, Liam? I make my own luck.
The reality is that as much as he insists upon this, it's just a lie he's telling himself. He has long since given up being the driver of his own destiny. He fell in with the Templars by chance and stuck with them because they make him feel better about himself. He doesn't make his own luck. He never did. This would all be amazing if it weren't for the 2 issues I've already discussed. The game is far too short, you kill 3 of the assassins one after another in the last chapter, which makes everything feel tremendously rushed. And the other is all the weird things they add to make Shay's journey more morally justifiable, which weakens the entire message about how manipulation happens and how dangerous it can be. But neither of those fully rob Shay's story of its heft for me. His fundamental humanity is too genuine to ignore. That you can track a straight path from Shay, the happy-go-lucky assassin, to Shay, the cold-blooded Templar, and find that somehow they're still the same person, still after the same things. Shay isn't a figure to be feared, as the assassins seem to think. He's someone to be pitied, because he'll never even realise the hole he's dug for himself. There is one more dangling thread of Rogue though. Interspersed into the story are flash forwards far into the future where a much older Shay has come to France. This is mostly to serve as a direct crossover with Assassin's Creed Unity, showing that it was in fact Shay that killed Arno's father at the start of that game. But what it also shows us is that Shay never changed. He tripled down on his Templar choices, and by this point, there truly is no brightness left. He may be a figure of pity, but that doesn't mean he can be redeemed. He's become a monster. He's here in France looking for that box, the same one he killed those men for all the way back at the start of the game. But there's no more sympathy, no more doubt. He's outlived all of the other Templars, including Haytham, but now he's ready to become the Haytham and start the cycle all over again. Assassin's Creed Rogue is a good game. I've certainly come across as more harsh than I actually feel about it in this video, probably because I just want Rogue to be so much more than it is. I don't want it to pull its punches like it does, and I want to spend more time in its story. Rogue might be a niche title, but I am absolutely a part of that niche. I am eating it all up. Likewise, I wish it had more to say about its historical setting than nothing. We get a Captain Cook cameo. Very exciting. You'll notice that I didn't have to bring that up for the entirety of the video. The 7 Years' War is only remembered for two things, lasting 9 years, and being the prologue to the American Revolution. Rogue could have showcased some of the genuinely interesting history of the war, but with its length it just doesn't have time to do that. Rogue's length probably has something to do with its conception as a consolation prize for people who can't afford next-gen consoles. It just didn't get the time and attention that Unity got, and it suffered the consequences. And personally, I would have flipped those priorities, but we'll get into that in a bit. Rogue is still the end of an era, the Kenway trilogy as it's now known, even though she isn't technically a Kenway, and also freedom cry and liberation sneak their way in there as well. The end of naval battles in the Americas in the 1700s. But more than that, it's the end of a lot of franchise staples that have been with the series since the beginning. Unity switched to a new engine and with it reset a lot of that stuff. Instead of just resting on those laurels, Rogue does something really weird and experimental with its story. Even if it doesn't always work properly, I love the effort because Rogue is the sort of game you can only make in a long-running franchise like Assassin's Creed, and I'll always appreciate it for that.
Uphold the principles of our order, and all that for which we stand. Never share our secrets, nor divulge the true nature of our work. Do so until death, whatever the cost. This is my new creed. I am Shay Patrick Cormac, Templar of the Colonial, of the American right. I am an older man now, and perhaps wiser. A war and a revolution have ended, and another is about to begin. May the Father of Understanding guide us all.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here, or just support the things I do, you don't have to sign up at this tier, there is a lower tier, then please consider signing up, it would mean a lot to me. As well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell because I have infiltrated this outpost in search of precious loot. To see my entire Assassin's Creed series critique, you can click this playlist up here, we're really in the thick of it now. Or for something else, here's a video about review bombing. That one could use some love.